Hello, and welcome everyone to Substance Use Prevention, Lesson 6, Protective and Risk Factors. A little bit about me. My name is Amanda. I am a health education and health promotion student at Arizona State University. If you have any questions, comments, or anything that you want to share with me about the lecture material, you can reach me at the Instagram and Facebook pages via comment or direct message, or you can comment below the lecture video as well. I'd love to hear feedback or answer any questions that you have, so don't be shy when reaching out. Lesson 6 topic. So this is lesson 6 of a 12 lecture series. Today's topic is protective and risk factors of substance use disorder. In this lecture, we are going to discuss the risk factors that may contribute to substance use disorder. We are also going to discuss protective factors. And we are going to think critically about our own lives with respect to these factors as well. Here we see a list of the student learning objectives for lesson 6. Our first student learning objective is participants will be able to define in writing one modifiable protective factor with 100% accuracy. Student learning objective number 2 is participants will be able to give an example of one biological risk factor in writing with 100% accuracy. Number 3 is participants will be able to give an example of one environmental risk factor in writing with 100% accuracy. The following student learning objective is participants will be able to give an example of one developmental risk factor in writing with 100% accuracy. The fifth student learning objective is participants will be able to identify in writing a minimum of one modifiable protective factor that they feel they have experienced with 100% accuracy. Following that, our next student learning objective is participants will be able to identify in writing a minimum of one modifiable protective factor that they feel they have not experienced with 100% accuracy. And then our last student learning objective, number 7, is participants will be able to create an example of a modifiable risk factor and then compare it to a modifiable protective factor in writing with 100% accuracy. Here is a summary of lesson 6. So this is what we're going to be covering and in what order for this lecture. The first thing we're going to look at are biological risk factors for substance use disorder. After we look at those, there's going to be a reflection and a written assignment. Then we'll move on to environmental risk factors. There'll be a reflection and a written assignment associated with those as well. Third, we will look at developmental risk factors and then do a reflection and written assignment. Then we'll touch on modifiable versus non-modifiable risk factors. What are the difference? And we'll give some examples of those. After that, we're going to move into modifiable protective factors. We'll have a reflection and then 3 written assignments about modifiable protective factors. After we cover that material, we'll do a brief review of everything that we learned in this lecture, and then we'll review the SLOs or the written assignments for the lesson number 6. And then, as always, we'll end lesson 6 with an independent practice assignment that is optional. All right, let's take a moment to just think about it. We are going to brainstorm different factors. So you can make a mental list or you can write them down if you'd like. I'd like you to just take a moment and think about the different factors, risk factors, or protective factors that you think are associated with substance use disorder. If you're confused about what protective factors are, think about things that might protect you against developing substance use disorder. That's a way you can think about it. Um, so take a moment to pause the lecture video, brainstorm your ideas, write them down. Don't write them down, it's up to you. And once you're done, maybe spend 2 to 3 minutes on this. When you've completed, go ahead and unpause the video and we will move into biological risk factors. Welcome back, everybody. Before we dive into biological risk factors, let's talk about what is a risk factor. Risk factors are the elements of a person's life that may increase the likeliness of developing or contracting a specific disease. So, key risk factors for substance use disorder are biological risk factors, environmental risk factors, and developmental risk factors. So the factors that we're going to look at today are going to be classified in these 3 groups. All right, let's focus on biological risk factors. A person's biological makeup can increase their odds of developing substance abuse disorder. So we've seen a little bit about this in our last lecture about how substance use disorder is considered an inheritable trait. Studies have shown that your genes can actually account for about 50% of the risk that an individual has for substance use disorder. Another way to look at this is having a family history of addiction can increase that risk as well. So this is, we're looking at your parents, and this is actually your close family as well. Some studies have linked gender and ethnicity to substance abuse disorder as well. We've learned that it's more likely that men will try and or abuse illegal substances. However, on the other end of the spectrum, it is more likely for women to experience intense cravings and relapse. What is relapse, you might be asking yourself? Well, relapse is when an individual returns to using drugs after they have experienced a period of sobriety or recovery. So with relapse, the person who has been suffering from substance use disorder enters into recovery or experiences a period of sobriety. So they're no longer using the substance. But for some reason, they return to using their drugs or a substance, and this is considered relapse. Another study linked with biological risk factors found that white and Hispanic students were more likely than their African American and Asian counterparts to report using or abusing drugs before and during college. Another risk factor for substance use disorder is the presence of a pre-existing mental health disorder. And we did cover that in our previous lectures. This is considered a biological risk factor. So having a pre-existing mental health disorder is considered a risk factor for substance use disorder. And we did see that mental health is linked to, is linked to substance abuse disorder. So it's a strong risk factor for that. Disorders such as depression, attention deficit, hyperactivity disorder, and post-traumatic stress disorder increase one's odds of developing a co-occurring substance use disorder. Now, these are not the only mental health disorders found to be commonly coexisting with substance use disorder. Keep that in mind. These are just a few examples up here that we have for just that, we're looking at today. The individual may use substances as a coping mechanism to treat the symptoms of these disorders. And that is one of the reasons that professionals think that the mental health disorder is a biological risk factor for substance use disorder. Okay, let's take a moment to just reflect on everything that we've just learned right now. Did any of these factors surprise you? There were some that may not have surprised you because we touched on some of these topics in prior lessons. What about the two studies that we discussed? Did you find either of these studies more interesting? We looked at the study that compared men's use and women's use. We also looked at a study that compared different racial backgrounds. Did you think that any of these risk factors, did you think of any of these risk factors at the beginning of the lecture when we were brainstorming? Do you think that you might have any of these risk factors? Have you experienced any of them? Do you know anybody that may have experienced any of these risk factors? Now, I know that talking about whether or not you have experienced these risk factors, or if anybody that you know has experienced these risk factors. So if you don't want to share that on the internet, you don't have to. If that's something you're comfortable with, you can comment that under the video section. But regardless, any of the questions that we have here, if you want to answer them on the comment section under the lecture video, please feel free to, and please feel free to comment on other participants' posts as well. And this takes us into our first written assignment for lesson number 6. I would like for you to give one biological risk factor in the comment section below the lecture video. As always, you can post your answers to Instagram or Facebook as well, or send them to me in direct message. And here is our Instagram and Facebook addresses. Instagram is at Substance Abuse Prevention 123 with no spaces. And Facebook is the same thing, Substance Abuse Prevention 123, but with spaces. All right, let's move into environmental risk factors. Environmental risk factors are elements that surround the individual in their everyday life. So this includes interactions with their family, social interactions, peer group relationships. Peer groups is people of the same age group as individuals, academic setting, academic performance, values and belief systems. So depending on what's going on in the family and home life, it can be a major risk factor contributing to substance use disorder. Chaotic home environments, parental abuse, parental use of substances, mental illness within the parents, and ineffective parenting. And then, of course, along with ineffective parenting is lack of parental involvement. These are all risk factors for substance use disorder. Now, lack of parental involvement is especially prevalent in children with conduct disorders or difficult temperaments. Sometimes the parents just they don't get as involved because they find that it's difficult to interact with these children. Additionally, when an individual lacks attachment to parental figures or does not receive nurturing from parents, it can increase the risk of substance use. Another risk factor occurs if the individual perceives that drug use is acceptable or encouraged. Now, this can happen at the family level, the peer level, work level, or community level. So in any of these settings or with any of these other people, if the individual perceives that these people use substances, or they encourage substance use, or they don't mind substance use, they find that it's acceptable or okay, that can increase the risk of developing substance use disorder as well. Risk factors can change in severity depending on age. So it has been determined that with children, family-related risk factors play a larger role. However, in adolescence, as the individual gets older, peer group-related risk factors actually play a greater role. So as the individual gets older, the risk factor that is most severe or plays the largest role in determining the development of substance use disorder can actually change. Here we see some school-specific risk factors. In school, risk factors may be demonstrated by poor performance in academics. Another risk factor is that may present itself in school is highly inappropriate behavior. We see here highly inappropriate aggressive behavior, or conversely overly shy behavior. So I like to categorize this together as highly inappropriate behavior. It could be very aggressive behavior. It could also be very, very shy behavior where the individual is doesn't make friends, doesn't communicate, is very kept to themselves and alone. Additionally, we see risk factors with social skills, coping skills, and behaviors. Poor social skills and poor coping skills are two additional environmental risk factors. They can manifest as an inability to make connections with peers. That's one example. Another one is displaying inappropriate responses to social stimulus. For example, if Susie tells Jamie that her dog died and Jamie laughs and thinks it's funny, that could be an inappropriate emotional response to the social stimulus, because a more appropriate response would be to respond with empathy or sympathy, trying to show understanding and support to Susie because her dog died. And then another example is inability to cope with emotions. So not being able to cope with sadness or anger, acting out because of these emotions, that's another risk factor as well. Or another example of these risk factors, I should say. Large amounts of stress are another risk factor. Experiencing large amounts of stress without those coping mechanisms to assist with stress management is a contributing risk factor as well. Large amounts of stress without the presence of coping mechanisms. If an individual has coping mechanisms to deal with the stress that they're experiencing, the risk factor isn't really there. But when they aren't able to cope with the large amounts of stress they're experiencing, that's an environmental risk factor. And then the last example here that we're looking at for environmental risk factors is engaging in deviant behaviors. Deviant behaviors are actions or behaviors that go against social norms. They could be violence, crime. Substance use itself is considered a deviant behavior. So other deviant behaviors also demonstrate an environmental risk for developing substance use disorder and using substances. All right, let's take a moment to just reflect on our environmental risk factors. Did any of the things that we just looked at right now, did they surprise you? Did you think of any of these risk factors at the beginning when we were brainstorming risks? Are there any that seem worse or maybe more prevalent than others? Do any see any of these risk factors? Do you think maybe some of them occur more often than others? What did you think of the information presented about age and the environmental risk factors? We saw that in childhood, parental and family risk factors played a larger role, but in adolescence, peer-related risk factors actually play a larger role. Does that seem to line up with what you see in your daily life? Do you think that you have experienced any of these risk factors, or do you know anybody that may have experienced any of these risk factors? These can be sensitive topics, so if you don't want to share your personal experiences on the internet, that's totally acceptable, but please feel free to comment your answers underneath the lecture video or on the Facebook pages as well. And don't be afraid to interact with your peers. And this takes us to our written assignment for environmental risk factors. What I would like you to do is give an example of one environmental risk factor in the comment section below the lecture video. You can post your answers on Instagram or Facebook pages as well, or direct message them to me if you'd like. And then we have our the addresses for our pages right here. The next risk factors that we are going to look at are developmental risk factors. Developmental risk factors are those that pertain to the exposure of an individual to substance use. So, trying drugs for the first time at an early age is the predominant developmental risk factor. So the earlier that one begins using drugs, the more likely that it is that one will progress into substance abuse disorder. So early use increases the likeliness. This presents a substantial risk for adolescents because key areas in the brain are still developing. And we did touch on that in one of our other lectures about the changes in the brain that occur when using substances. So it presents a very big risk for adolescents who use substances because these parts of the brain are not even fully developed yet. And remember from our previous lectures that these areas affect judgment, decision-making, self-control, and this makes teens susceptible to engaging into risky behaviors, and we know that using substances is in itself a risky behavior. Another developmental factor pertains to the type of drug that an individual uses. Type of drug. Use of some substances may result in a faster development of the physical addiction. Two examples of these substances are considered highly addictive are stimulants and opioid painkillers. Risk of addiction may be increased by the delivery method as well. So, smoking and intravenous drug usage, which if you recall from previous lectures, that's when an individual places the drug in a needle and they inject the drugs into their body with the needle. They're considered they're more likely to result in addiction rather than other methods, but also keep in mind that just because a person isn't using drugs through intravenous use or smoking does not mean that they cannot develop substance use disorder. Other methods of use can also lead to addiction as well. It's just that these methods are considered more likely. Let's just take a moment to reflect on any of that. Did either of those risk factors or examples that we talked about surprise you? Did you think of any of these at the beginning of the lecture when we were brainstorming? And are there any risk factors or examples that seem worse or maybe more influential than the others? Go ahead and comment your thoughts in the comment section below the lecture video, and feel free to discuss it with the other participants in the discussion. And then this takes us to our next written assignment. I would like you to give an example of one developmental risk factor in the comment section below the lecture video. You can post your comments on Instagram or Facebook as always. You can send them in a DM, and then I have the addresses of our Instagram and Facebook listed right here as well. Modifiable versus non-modifiable risk factors. So you might be wondering, we talked a little bit about these in the beginning of the lecture video. What's the difference between a modifiable and a non-modifiable risk factor? Well, modifiable risk factors can be changed. These are the risk factors that we can take action to change them, to lessen the risk, or to change it from being a risk to a protective factor. On the other hand, non-modifiable risk factors they cannot be changed. You can't do anything about these. So we're going to take some examples. Right now, we're going to take a look at some examples of modifiable and non-modifiable risk factors so you can kind of get an idea of what they are. So here is a list of our modifiable risk factors. So remember, modifiable means that they can be changed. Our modifiable risk factors include interactions with family, social interactions, peer group relations, academic setting and performance. You could change the school that you go to. You can get better grades. You can get worse grades. So these things are the things that can change. Values and belief systems, although those are probably hard to change, they can be changed. Home environment can change. You can change the home that you live in. The attitude of the environment, the energy of the home can change as well. Parental involvement, parents can go from not being involved to being involved, or vice versa. Individual behaviors can change. Social skills, an individual can have no social skills and then learn and develop social skills. The same thing goes for coping skills and stress management skills. And then beliefs about substance use can change as well. So these are our environmental risk factors here that are modifiable. And then over here we see our developmental risk factors as well. We have age of exposure to substance. An individual who is already exposed to substances at a young age, once you've already been exposed, you can't travel back in time and change that. But you can delay the age that one is exposed to substances, and so that is modifiable by delaying the exposure. Type of substances used can be changed, and method of delivery as well are all modifiable. Non-modifiable risk factors cannot be changed. Here we see a lot of our biological risk factors because you can't change your genetics or what is already, these things have already been determined. So anything that's going on in the genes, genetics, even epigenetics are non-modifiable for the individual. Family history of substance use disorder can't be changed. An individual's sex and race also cannot be changed as well. All right, we are going to move into protective factors. Protective factors are the elements of one's life that decrease the likelihood of developing substance use disorder. And many of these modifiable protective factors, remember that means protective factors that can be changed. These are the things that we can do something about to increase our protective factors in our life. Many of them are environmental in nature. All right, here we see some family protective factors. So these are the factors that happen within the home or within the family that can protect against substance use disorder, or they decrease the likeliness of developing substance use disorder. So our family protective factors right here, they include strong family bonds and positive relationships within the family. Another one is parents who create clear and consistent rules and who monitor their children's activity. So it reduces the chance of the child using and abusing drugs. Additionally, parents are encouraged to pay attention to their children's friends, their peers, their behaviors, and that will also increase protective factors as well. Generally, parent involvement in the life of the individual is a protective factor for substance use. So these strong family bonds and these positive relationships really create and they solidify these protective factors. Social protective factors, strong and successful academic performance, as well as positive bonds within the institution. So an institution, they can be any type of group or organization, schools, religious organizations like churches, extracurricular teams could be considered a institution that would be a protective factor, like a team or a club of some sort, which we see right here, extracurricular teams and clubs as well. The ability to develop and maintain positive and healthy social connections is a key positive factor. To develop and maintain positive, healthy social connections. So being connected socially with the peers around you is a protective factor. And now we're going to look at individual protective factors. Belief and adherence to conventional norms about drug use is a protective factor against the development of addiction and against trying or using drugs itself. So conventional norms, that would be that drugs are unacceptable, using drugs is a deviant behavior. The conventional norm about drug use is that it's a faux pas, it's not good. Individuals who believe that drug use is not the norm and that deviant behavior, they are less likely to use and abuse drugs. And that is how these individual behaviors can be a modifiable protective factor. So let's take a moment and pause and think about everything that we've learned here in the last section. Do you think that you have experienced any of these protective factors? Do you see any protective factors that you haven't experienced? Can you think of anybody who you know who exhibits all of the protective factors that we just talked about? Or can you think of anybody who exhibits zero, no protective factors? And do you think there are any of these factors that you might feel are more important than others? And if so, why? And if not, why? If you want to take a moment to pause the video, you can, or you can always answer these questions later, comment them under the lecture video, and feel free to discuss your answers with the other participants as well. So here we see the first written assignment for this last section. I would like you to identify one or more modifiable protective factor that you have experienced, one that you have experienced, in the comment section below the video. Or you can comment them on the Instagram or Facebook pages as well. We have the address posted here. Our second assignment is to identify one or more modifiable protective factors that you have not experienced, one that you're not familiar with, or maybe if you've experienced them all, just one that you have the least experience with. Comment your answer under the lecture video or on the Instagram or Facebook pages as well. The next and final written assignment for the modifiable protective factors that we discussed is to create an example of a modifiable risk factor and then compare it to an example of a modifiable protective factor in words in the comment section below the lecture video or on the Instagram or Facebook pages. So that will probably be a few more sentences than the other two posts, likely. All right, let's just do a very, very brief review of everything that we've discussed in lesson 6. Risk factors for substance use disorder can be biological, environmental, or developmental. A modifiable risk or protective factor is one that can be changed. Conversely, a non-modifiable risk or factor is one that cannot be changed. And then lastly, protective factors are elements of one's life that decrease the likelihood of developing a substance use disorder. Just in case you forgot, here is a summary of all of the written assignments. If you haven't completed them already, here they are. We have given example of a biological risk factor, give an example of an environmental risk factor, give an example of a developmental risk factor, identify at least one modifiable protective factor that you have experienced, identify one modifiable protective factor that you have not experienced, and then lastly, create an example of a modifiable risk factor and then compare it to a modifiable protective factor. Remember that you can comment your answers beneath the lecture video. You can comment them on Instagram or Facebook, or you can send them to me in direct message on Instagram or Facebook. If you're interested in any of the topics that we've discussed today and you want to explore a little bit more, this is a great place to start. Here are the resources that I use to compile some of the data for this lesson plan. And as always, we're going to close out lesson 6 with the independent practice assignment, which of course is optional to you. In this independent practice, you are asked to create a poster that defines one modifiable protective factor. You can use words, you can use pictures, you can draw it yourself, you can create the poster on the computer. Use your creativity to complete this assignment, and you can submit it by posting it to social media and tagging the Instagram or Facebook pages, or by direct message on one of those platforms. So thank you for watching the lesson 6. I hope that it was you got a lot out of it, and I will see you in lesson 7, where we will be talking about treatment and resources for substance use disorder.